Hello and welcome to another video review. This is Uncharted 3, Drake's Deception, originally released for PlayStation 3 but later re-released as part of the Nathan Drake collection on PlayStation 4. What you're seeing here is the remastered version that's on PS4. This is a third-person action-adventure game and the sequel to Uncharted 2 Among Thieves. It was developed by Naughty Dog and published by Sony in 2011 for PlayStation 3, and it later saw a re-release in the Nathan Drake collection for PlayStation 4, although that version does not have the multiplayer component, so I won't be talking about that in this particular review. And of course, like all Naughty Dog games, and of course all of the Uncharted games, it received an absolutely massive amount of critical acclaim when it was released, although it did receive less acclaim than its predecessor, which of course brings up the question of how good of a sequel this is, as well as how good of a game in general it is, because quite frankly, the Uncharted series up to this point has not been particularly good as a game series, even though it does have very high production values. Well, let's go ahead and delve into this thing and find out what exactly we're dealing with here. Well, as far as presentation goes, again, you have to keep in mind that I am playing the remastered version here, but this one actually benefits the least from the remasters in terms of all three of the Uncharted games, because this was a very late PS3 title, and they really pulled out all the stops for this one. I did look at a side-by-side comparison of the original PS3 version with the PS4 remastered version, and the difference is actually not that great. The PS4 version does have higher quality textures, it does have some enhanced effects on it for post-processing, but unlike the previous two games where it does look like they've been pretty much rebuilt from the ground up, this one looks like it was just a very slight upgrade, and that is because the original PS3 version looked pretty fantastic for its day. The modeling is excellent, the animations are excellent, although the lip sync when you're outside of cutscenes is a bit iffy here and there. And you do also have the problem of them reusing several of the animations from previous Uncharted games, including the reload animation for all of the primary weapons except for the ones where it is not feasible to have that same animation, such as the sawed-off shotgun or the grenade launcher or something along those lines. At worst, it looks a bit off because you do have some issues with clipping on some of the models, and it doesn't necessarily line up exactly with the models themselves, and in others, such as the M29, it looks absolutely ridiculous because there is no bolt handle to rack on that particular side of the rifle. And while I can understand why they didn't necessarily do custom animations for everything, it is still really annoying that they still haven't fixed this since the original Uncharted. Apart from the ridiculously over-exaggerated recoil animations that were in the first game, they have not fixed any of the same weapon handling animation problems that they've had since the beginning, and it's actually really lazy considering how much effort they put into everything else. Because everything else means that the PS3 version actually still holds up rather well in terms of visuals. I mean, it definitely looks a bit dated, but it's not so dated that you could say, oh, well, it's hideous or anything like that. And of course the PS4 version is looking rather solid, although it does have a few artifacts of it being an older game that was brought up to a more modern spec as far as visuals go. And in some instances you will actually notice that because the level of fidelity you can achieve on the PS4 is considerably higher than what you could achieve on PS3, and they haven't really maxed out the hardware here either. But while the visuals still hold up very well and the remaster does help them to hold up a bit more, the sound design is mostly unchanged as far as I can tell from the previous release. Which means that it's kind of all over the place. The voice acting, as always, is absolutely brilliant. All of the characters are voiced extremely well, they are often very funny, and they really do lend the game a ton of charm that really does help it out quite a lot in the long run. What helps it a bit less is the soundtrack, which once again is still a good soundtrack, it's just that it's not that memorable outside of the confines of the game. It's a fairly generic orchestral action-adventure soundtrack with some cultural elements that are ripped from the cultures that you're visiting in this particular title. This means it's well in keeping with what you saw with the previous two games in the series. It's still a good soundtrack, but again, it's not memorable outside of the confines of the game. It's not the kind of music you'd be able to listen to on its own and go, oh yeah, that's from Uncharted. You'd just say, oh, that's action-adventure soundtrack. Which is mildly disappointing, but it's not something that's going to be a deal breaker. Similarly disappointing but not a deal breaker are the sound effects, where the gun sounds are actually a bit beefier than they were in the previous two games in the series, but they're still not particularly beefy. Certain particularly powerful weapons do actually sound rather powerful this time around, it's just they don't have the kind of bass that would be really great. It's the kind of bass that rattles you around a bit and gets you excited, and you don't really get that with the gun and explosion sounds in Uncharted. At least you haven't up to this point, and unfortunately unfortunately Uncharted 3 does not really do that either. Luckily, the sound effects they do use are powerful enough to where you don't feel like you're shooting pea shooters, but you don't feel like you're shooting hand cannons either, even though in some cases you actually are. But they are certainly improved, at least in general, over the previous games in the series, and you do have this sense that they're trying to get to a point where it has just the right amount of oomph, but they're just not quite there yet. And when you bring everything together, you do have presentation that still holds up rather well for the original release, and the PS4 version is certainly no slouch either. But here's the thing, the presentation still holding up is definitely a benefit for the game, but it's not the be-all end-all. What really matter for a video game are the story and the gameplay especially, and the gameplay is what the previous two games were deficient in. So of course that brings up the question of how are the story and much more importantly the gameplay in Uncharted 3. Well, before we answer that question with regards to gameplay, let's go ahead and talk about the story. Now, I will have to talk about the story in very general terms so I don't spoil anything for you, because this thing really prides itself on its twists and turns. But the really short version is that you play as Nathan Drake and you are going along with your mentor Victor Sullivan, or Sully as he's known, in order to find the lost city of Ubar. This is something that Nathan himself has been working on for about 20 or so years, and it's finally coming to fruition. So he's in it for the long haul there, and everybody else sees it as something of an obsession. But of course, he's not the only one who's interested in this thing. The other people who are interested are led by Catherine Marlowe, a woman with absolutely excessive amounts of resources and some degree of a past with both Sully and Nathan. She's also absolutely hell-bent on finding the lost city of Ubar, and Nathan and Sully both want to stop her from doing that because she clearly wants to get to that city by any means necessary. And at the beginning of the game, you do find out there is more to her than meets the eye, and there's clearly more to it than simply, oh, they want the treasure. There's obviously something else they're looking for, but you don't find out what that is until pretty late in the game. Until then, you're following the clues left behind by Sir Francis Drake as well as T.E. Lawrence, better known by most people as Lawrence of Arabia, and that will take you on a journey all over the world in order to find the various clues you need in order to find the lost city of Ubar. Along the way, you will be dealing with numerous characters, both returning from the previous games in the series as well as a few new additions here and there, all of whom are actually very interesting and well voice acted, which means that they actually end up being very compelling characters for the course of the game. And really, they're the main draw as far as the writing goes, because the story is not terrible, but it's not particularly great either. It is paced a bit better and is presented a bit better than the previous two games, but it does rely more on these weird Deus Ex Machina that just kind of get thrown into the mix with no real rhyme or reason, as well as numerous moments that will leave you scratching your head throughout the entire course of the game, and even after the end you're sitting there going, wait a minute, why did that happen? More importantly, how did it happen, because that just kind of came out of nowhere. To give you an example that I will give you a bit of a warning of a spoiler here, I'm not going to name any names or anything like that, but a particular character gets shot at one point, and then a few moments later they show up without a scratch on them, and you're like, wait a minute, what just happened? And the game even calls that out. One of the characters explicitly says, hang on a minute, how is that guy still walking around? More importantly, how is he unscathed? He just got shot and we all saw it. And this is never explained. That's the sort of problem you have to deal with in Uncharted 3 on a fairly regular basis, which means that the plot itself ends up falling a bit flat here and there, and you really do have to rely more on the character interactions to keep you interested. Now luckily, these are just as strong as they've ever been, and they really do drive the plot forward instead of the actual plot driving itself forward. Which of course does mean that even though this is a much more personal thing for Nate, and you do get some more of his backstory as well as something that actually seems to fit him a lot better, and also manages to really capture that Indiana Jones vibe, it's not the kind of thing that can stand unsupported. You do need the gameplay to back it up, and that is where this game does fall into a big pit. Because mechanically it is nearly identical to Uncharted 2. It still has the fairly basic platforming that we saw in the previous two games, and that's mostly unchanged, although the controls seem a bit finicky in this one compared to the previous two, which is a bit odd. Sometimes your inputs don't register exactly as you put them in. For example, you may try to jump to the left of something, but instead of jumping to the left, you end up jumping behind or something along those lines. It is really annoying when it does happen, but it doesn't happen all the time. which is what makes it frustrating. Because you'll be putting in the input that seems to be the correct one, but for some reason it just doesn't work. Now luckily the game does save checkpoints very frequently, so you're probably not going to have to repeat too much if you do end up falling to your doom, but most of the time it's perfectly fine, so you don't need to worry too much about it. What you do need to worry more about is the combat system, which is pretty much exactly the same as it was in the previous game in the series. Extremely bare-bones third-person cover-based shooter, where you have a button for sticky cover, then you lean out and you shoot at things. If you get headshots, it instantly downs the guy, unless he's a heavy trooper, in which case it will take several headshots to bring them down. Also, if they're wearing a helmet, first you have to knock the helmet off, and then you can get the headshot to bring them down. Beyond that, you have 2 weapon slots, one for a pistol, and then one for a primary weapon of some description, whether that be an assault rifle, a sniper rifle, a rocket launcher, something along those lines. Certain weapons are ridiculously powerful compared to others, to the point where they're pretty much a one-shot kill no matter where you hit on some of those things, and some of the enemies can take multiple shots from those before going down, such as the heavy troopers. This means that certain enemies that you will face are definitely bullet sponges. The thing is that they're not quite as spongy as they were in the previous game. Clearly they learned from at least some of their mistakes, and now when you're going up against a bullet sponge, it doesn't take you forever and a day to bring them down, it just takes you forever. Now that said, they did make a few other changes to the combat system that do actually help things out quite a bit. For example, they give you the ability to throw back grenades that enemies throw at you. Now you're given a very small window to do this, but whenever a grenade is thrown at you, and if it's close enough to you, then a meter will pop up on the screen with a white area that once the cursor has gone into that area, you can press the triangle button to grab the grenade and throw it back at an enemy safely away from you. This means that you don't always have to go diving out of cover, exposing yourself to massive amounts of machine gun fire and inevitably getting mowed down. If the grenade's too far away from you, however, you will still need to dive out of cover, and that does happen on occasion. So it does add a bit of variety to the combat and means that you're not constantly getting lured out into getting mowed down, which is definitely an improvement. That doesn't really affect the frequency at which enemies throw grenades at you. They do still throw them at you quite a lot, so they do try to flush you out of cover quite often, and occasionally they will try to flank you as well, so that actually does help to make things a bit more interesting as well. The problem comes in when enemies flank you and there's not really much you can do about it, because it takes a long time for your health to regenerate in this compared to other third-person shooters, and if you take even the slightest amount of damage, then that completely resets the timer on that, so you end up getting stuck behind cover quite often, and the enemies can flank you pretty easily. And much like in Uncharted 2, you still can't take very much damage, so it means that combat becomes a very frustrating experience. At least the melee is no longer part of that frustration though, because the melee system that was garbage in the previous game has been improved up to at least vaguely competent in this one. And by that I mean, it's still pretty much just mash the square button until the enemy falls over, but they also have the addition of being able to break out of grapples by hammering the circle button, as well as being able to grab enemies and throw them into things with the circle button, or being able to use the triangle button to counterattack. Sometimes when you throw enemies up against things, you'll be able to finish them off using the environment as well. It's just something that automatically happens. So for example, if you're in a bar fight and you throw a guy up against the bar, then you might be able to grab a beer bottle and smash it over his head. Like I said, you don't really have any real control over the animation that happens, so it is something of a rarity, but it is still fun when it happens. In one case, for example, I ended up smacking a guy with a big fish, which was pretty amusing. But the system having more options available to you, as well as being faster than the previous 2 games, means that it is more enjoyable to use than them, and now it's not as incredibly irritating to use as it was in Uncharted 2, where it was practically useless. But the biggest change to Uncharted 3's gameplay by far is the addition of quite a lot of puzzles. The previous 2 games did still have puzzles in them, but they were relatively few and far between. This time, a very large chunk of the game is devoted to puzzle solving. Now, they still make it way too easy by giving you all the solutions right there, but it really does go a long way to making you feel like a proper treasure hunter who's trying to solve an ancient mystery. And it's moments like that, where you have these long, uninterrupted sequences of just platforming, exploration, and puzzle solving, and you're actually piecing together the mystery as you go along, that end up making this thing work far better than both of its predecessors combined. It means that the pacing is actually better. You have these sequences where you're going through the puzzle solving, you're exploring the things around you, you're getting more of the actual story, and then on from that you have action sequences that spice things up a bit. Then you're back to more exploring and story. It's not like the previous two games where you felt like an action hero first and an explorer and treasure hunter a distant 20th. Here they finally understood that they needed to balance things out a bit more, and what you end up with is a game where Nathan finally feels like a proper combination of an action hero, but also a treasure hunter, an explorer, and a thief. But that doesn't change a few simple realities. First off, mechanically this game is average at its absolute best. The platforming is functional, and the combat is also functional, but generally a bit on the weaker side. You can find plenty of third-person shooters with better combat systems than this. The puzzles are fairly rudimentary, and the fact that the game gives you all the solutions right then and there is really the big problem. If they didn't just tell you exactly what you need to do, then it would make them more interesting. You'd actually have to think about them more. Instead, the game's like, here, just do this, and you're like, okay. So that renders the puzzles rather unsatisfying as a whole, but the fact that there are more of them does actually contribute to you feeling more like a treasure hunter, so it is somewhat of a mixed bag. And then, of course, there are the chase sequences, which are downright infuriating because the camera constantly changes its angle on you when you're moving along. This means that you could be preparing to do a jump, and then the camera angle will change, and suddenly you're not going exactly where you thought you were going, and you end up falling to your doom, or something along those lines. What's even more annoying is when the camera is facing behind you, so you can't actually see where you're going, and you're just only seeing what you're running from. Now, on the one hand, that makes sense. On the other hand, how are you expected to avoid obstacles if the camera is not showing you the obstacles? It's the kind of thing that makes you wonder if the developers actually played a video game before they made one. And once you get out of the gameplay mechanics, you find that while the presentation is certainly top-notch, the writing itself is not. It has its moments, sure, but then it also has moments where you're like, wait a minute, what just happened? Or even better than that, moments that are just bizarre, contrived, and never explained. And when you bring everything together, you find that this is a very mixed bag of a title. On the one hand, they finally figured out how to make you feel like an explorer and treasure hunter as well as a thief and an action hero at the same time, but unfortunately the plot itself is not very strong, and the gameplay mechanics are barely improved over the previous two titles, meaning that much like the previous two games, it is primarily flash and not a huge amount of substance. It's certainly not a terrible game or anything like that, but it's not a particularly good one either. But the thing is, the increased emphasis on story and exploration and puzzle solving over the previous two games does actually make this a better game as a result. Ultimately, Uncharted 3 is a better overall game than Uncharted 2 was, even though certain elements are not as good and certain elements are better, which ultimately makes this a 3 out of 5. But I can still only recommend it if you're getting it, for example, in the Nathan Drake collection where you're getting 3 games for the price of 1, or if you get it for a really cheap price on PS3. Thanks for watching.